This Filmmaker IQ lesson is sponsored by ICANN, award-winning designer, manufacturer, and distributor of professional video, film, and broadcast production equipment, and by Blackmagic Design, creating the world's highest quality solutions for feature film, post-production, and television broadcast industries.
Welcome to FilmmakerIQ.com. I'm John Hess, and today we'll probe into the brain, digging deep for clues to the question, why do we go to scary movies? There's something about horror that speaks directly and instinctively to the human animal. Millions of years of evolutionary psychology have ingrained in our minds certain fear triggers, a survival instinct. Fear of the dark, where predators might be lying in wait. Fear of animals with large, sharp teeth who would make a quick meal of us. A fear of the poisonous spider that can kill with one bite. So ingrained in our developmental psychology that research done by Nobuo Masataka show that children as young as 3 have an easier time spotting snakes on a computer screen than they do spotting flowers. Research by Christoph Cook show that the right amygdala, the portion of the brain associated with fear learning, responds more vigorously to images of animals than to images of people, landmarks, or objects, even though those things are much more dangerous in our civilized world. This may explain the shape of our movie monsters, creatures with sharp teeth or snake-like appearance. The fear of being eaten alive also explains the cannibalistic traits of human monsters like Dracula or Dr. Hannibal Lecter. But brain scan research in 2010 by Thomas Straub at the Friedrich Schiller University of Jena show that scary movies don't actually activate fear responses in the amygdala at all. Instead, it was other parts of the brain that were firing, the visual cortex, the part of the brain responsible for processing visual information, the insular cortex self-awareness, the thalamus, the relay switch between the brain hemispheres, and the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain associated with planning, attention, and problem solving. So, we're not really being scared at the movies at all, at least not in the brain chemistry way. What's going on? Before we try to explain the psychological attraction to horror, let's establish what the allure of horror is. Psychologist Dr. Glenn D. Walters identifies 3 primary factors of the horror film allure. The first is tension, created through mystery, suspense, gore, terror, or shock. This is pretty straightforward elements of horror, the craft and technique of filmmaking. The second factor is relevance. In order for a horror film to be seen, it has to be relevant to the potential viewers. This relevance can take the form of a universal relevance, capturing universal fears of things like death and the unknown. Or it could take on cultural relevance, dealing with societal issues. Audiences can find subgroup relevance, groups like teenagers which have many horror films written about them. And lastly, there is a personal relevance, either in a way that identifies with the protagonist or in a way that condemns the antagonist or victims to their ultimate fate. Now, the last factor, which may be the most counterintuitive, is unrealism. Despite the graphic nature of recent horror films, we all know at some level that what we are watching is not real. Haight, Macaulay, and Rosen conducted research on disgust, showing students in 1994 a series of gruesome documentary videos. Now, few could make it to the end, and yet these same students would pay to see even worse acts conducted on a movie screen. Now, why? Perhaps because when we walk into a theater, we know what we're seeing on the screen is fabricated reality. Movies are edited from multiple camera angles with soundtracks, and sometimes horror is tempered and made palatable with black humor, a sly wink that what we are seeing on screen isn't real. This also explains why we all remember that scary movie we saw when we were just way too young to be watching those scary movies. But when we look at it now, it looks kind of hokey. Children have a harder time separating reality from fiction, especially when it's on a movie screen. So according to Walters, movies that bring high levels of tension are relevant in universal, cultural, subgroup, and personal ways, while still maintaining an air of unrealism, have the greatest horror appeal. So we have an idea of what horror is. Why are people drawn to it? The psychoanalytic community, including Sigmund Freud himself, posits that horror came from the uncanny, emergence of images and thoughts of the primitive id that were being suppressed by the civilized ego. Jung thought that horror movies tapped into our primordial archetypes, buried deep in our collective subconscious. Images like shadow and mother play an important role in the horror genre. But psychoanalysis is hard to test empirically, so you can't really say if these ideas fall really more into the realm of philosophy. Now, speaking of philosophy, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, and yes, I know he didn't exactly watch horror films, but he thought people were attracted to scary stories and violent dramatic plays because it gave them a chance to purge their negative emotions, a process he called catharsis. Using Aristotle's argument, we would watch violent movies and play violent video games to release pent-up feelings of aggression. Well, unfortunately for Aristotle, research has shown quite the opposite. Watching violence actually makes people more aggressive. Pent-up feelings of anger can actually be reduced by watching something else, like humor or erotica. But there may still be a correlation between watching horror films and the reduction of fear. The excitation transfer theory is sort of a new take on catharsis. Dr. Dolph Zillman argued in 1978 that the negative feelings created by horror movies actually intensify the positive feelings when the hero triumphs in the end. But what about movies where the hero doesn't triumph? And even some small studies show that people's enjoyment was actually higher during the scary parts of a horror film than it was after. Film scholar Noel Carroll puts forth an idea that horror films are the product of curiosity and fascination. Horror exists outside of everyday existence of normal behavior. Studies by Tamborini, Stiff, and Zillman have shown that there is a significant correlation between people who are accepting of norm-violating behavior and interest in horror movies. But that doesn't explain why some viewers respond positively when norm violators such as the sexually promiscuous teenage couple, the criminal, and the adulterer are punished and killed off by the movie monster. Well, this enjoyment of punishment of those that deserve it make up the dispositional alignment theory. We like horror movies because the people on screen getting killed deserve it. But this may give us insight into who audiences want to see eat it, but it's not a clear picture of why horror films are popular in the first place. Another theory put forth by Marvin Zuckerman in 1979 proposed that people who scored high on the sensation-seeking scale often reported a greater interest in exciting things like roller coasters, bungee jumping, and horror films. Researchers have found a correlation, but it isn't always significant. Even Zuckerman noted that picking only one trait misses the fact that there are a lot of things that draw people to horror films. The gender socialization theory put forth in 1986 by Zillman, Weaver, Mundorf, and Ost considers horror films as sort of a codification of traditional gender roles, which is often referred to as the snuggle theory. Experiments with adolescent boys found that they enjoyed a horror film much more when their female companion, who was a research plant, was visibly scared. The opposite was true with girls, who found horror films less enjoyable when their male counterparts were physically scared. The girls enjoyed the film more when their boys were brave and handled their fear. Now, this may be one shade of how horror films play in our culture, but it doesn't explain why people go to horror films alone or what happens after adolescence. And finally, DJ Skull posits that horror films are a reflection of our societal fears. Looking at the history of horror, we have mutant monsters rising in the 50s from our fear of the nuclear boogeyman, zombies in the 60s with Vietnam, Nightmare on Elm Street as a mistrust of authority figures stemming from the Watergate scandals, and zombies again in the 2000s as a reflection of our viral pandemic fears. But for as many horror cycles that fit the theory, there are many that just don't. And horror films work on a universal level, crossing national boundaries, working on all different cultures. If these 8 theories are at best incomplete, what's going on? Well, first we have to approach the question with the idea that not all of us watch all horror films for the same reason. In a 1995 study, Deidre D. Johnson studied 220 high school students watching slasher films and found that motivations for watching these films fell into 4 general categories. Gore watching, characterized by low empathy, high sensation seeking, and in males, a strong identification with the killer. Thrill watching, which is high empathy and high sensation seeking, motivated by the suspense of the film and more of an identification with the victims. Then there's independent watching, high empathy for the victim with a high positive effect of overcoming fear. And finally, problem watching, the opposite, high empathy for the victim, but characterized by negative feelings of helplessness at the end of the film. Now, with just a small sample of adolescents in a subset of the horror genre, the slasher genre, we can see that there are many reasons why people watch horror, and sometimes those motivations might change from day to day or from movie to movie. The complexities of the brain and the variation in people's tastes, they just don't allow for simple universal explanations. Though the brain scan research I mentioned earlier may shed some light on this topic. Film is the ultimate artistic medium so far devised by man. It combines photography, motion, visual arts, acting, writing, and music, a sensory experience that engages us so completely that watching a movie is often compared to dreaming. So would that make horror films nightmares? The truth is, we still don't know why we dream. The contemporary theory of dreaming, as described by Ernest Hartman, the professor of psychiatry at Tufts University in Medicine, sees dreams as the brain sorting through bits of information it's gathered throughout the waking hours. These images and connections we make while dreaming aren't totally random. They're guided by our emotions. Maybe we're working through a recent trauma or dealing with angst and fear. So perhaps watching a film is somewhere between being awake and being in a dream state. Much like play, film is a safe place where we can sort through stuff, learn skills, and apply them to everyday life. How do you defeat Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th? You can't outrun his slow stride. The only way to kill him is to face him straight on. And though a zombie apocalypse may be a far-fetched reality, the survivorship skills on display in a zombie horror film have some practical merit in our normal everyday world. Horror films require us to face the unknown, to understand it, to make it less scary. They allow us to see our fears and put them into context, to play what if, and in doing so, they shape our belief system, how we see each other, and how we see ourselves. They are a safe place to explore, and for some, just a good bit of fun. The fact is, we are just getting to understand how our brains work. But scary stories, well, that's something that will never go away. In the words of Arthur Conan Doyle, where there is no imagination, there is no horror. Go out there, make something terrifying. I'm John Hess. I'll see you at filmmakeriq.com.